They called
You
her a
shouldn't have come
monster.
here.
The scarred waitress at Victory Diner
We
hid
needed
beneath
to
long
talk
sleeves every day,
about
enduring
what
cool
happened back
whispers from
then.
customers who saw only ugliness where something else lay hidden. For 3 years, Eleanor Ellie Rogers had kept her secret pouring coffee while people mocked her appearance and threw tips on the floor like she was beneath them. Hey, old witch, why you always wearing long sleeves when it's 95 degrees out? The voice carried across the diner intentionally loud enough for everyone to hear. The morning crowd at Victory Diner paused, forks hovering mid-air, coffee cups suspended between table and lip, as all eyes turned toward the source of the disruption. Jason Miller stood in the entrance, flanked by his construction crew, his 6'2" frame blocking the sunlight that had been streaming through the glass door. He wore that familiar smirk, the one that had been terrorizing Eleanor Rogers for the better part of 3 years. They didn't know that the deformed hands of that woman had once saved 17 lives in a battle America never officially acknowledged. What was about to happen would shock this entire town to its core. Victory Diner sat on the main street of Riverdale, a small town nestled in the shadow of Fort Campbell. The establishment wore its patriotism. Proudly American flags adorned the walls, alongside faded photographs of soldiers from various conflicts. A wall of honor near the register displayed the names and photographs of local veterans, their service dates and branches listed in meticulous detail. The decor spoke of a bygone-era Cold War memorabilia, model aircraft suspended from the ceiling, and era recruiting posters carefully preserved under glass. The morning regulars had their assigned spots, an unspoken seating chart that no one dared violate. Frank Dawson, 78, former 82nd Airborne, occupied table 3 with his wife Martha. Frank always wore his division ball cap, faded with age, but still proudly displaying the All-American patch. His hands, spotted with age and scarred from a lifetime of work, wrapped around his coffee mug with surprising strength. Martha, 75, kept a watchful eye on everyone from behind her reading glasses, newspapers spread before her, but rarely read. Richard Rick Cooper, 43, sat at the counter, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his mechanic's jumpsuit. The Fort Campbell tank mechanic came in every morning at 6:30 sharp for coffee and eggs over easy. He nodded respectfully to Eleanor as she refilled his cup, never making eye contact for too long, a soldier's courtesy to another soldier, though neither of them ever acknowledged that silent understanding. Eleanor moved through the diner with quiet efficiency, her movements precise and economical. To the casual observer, she was simply a dedicated employee. But to the trained eye, there were telltale signs: the way she always chose shifts with fewer customers, how she constantly scanned the room, checking exits, assessing each new patron that walked through the door. She always kept her back to the wall when possible, her eyes tracking movement with the alertness of someone who had learned the hard way that threats could come from anywhere. The bell above the door chimed again, this time with a gentler tone, as it announced a different kind of visitor. Thomas Reynolds entered Victory Diner for the first time, though he had been watching it from across the street for 3 days. At 68, Reynolds carried himself with the upright posture of a man who had spent decades in uniform. His steel gray hair was cropped short, military regulation, despite being retired for 15 years. Weather lines creased his face deepest around eyes that missed nothing. He chose a booth in the corner with a clear view of the entire establishment, instinctively selecting the tactical position that offered both observation and protection. The Zippo lighter he placed on the table bore the worn insignia of the Special Forces, a silent declaration of identity to anyone who knew what to look for. Thomas ordered black coffee when Eleanor approached, but his eyes followed her movements with an intensity that went beyond casual interest. There was something familiar in the way she moved, something in her posture, and the precise way she placed items on the table. As she walked away, Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a weathered photograph. The image showed a group of Special Forces operators in desert camouflage posed against the backdrop of a military base. The notation on the back read simply, "Persian Gulf, 1991, Operation Desert Storm." His finger traced one face in the group, then moved to study Eleanor as she worked behind the counter. "I've been searching for Sergeant Eleanor Angel Rogers for 34 years, he whispered to himself. And now I've found her pouring coffee in a backwater diner. The morning rhythm of the diner was disrupted as Jason Miller and his construction crew claimed the largest table, their boots tracking mud across the freshly mopped floor. Jason, 35, carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed his local importance exceeded his actual status. A former high school football star whose potential had peaked at 18, he now supervised a construction crew with the same bullying tactics that had made him feared in the school hallways years ago. "The usual for me and my boys, and make it snappy," Jason called out, not bothering to look at Eleanor directly. "And bring extra napkins. Last time there were fingerprints all over my glass. Probably from those claws of yours." His crew chuckled obediently, the sound harsh and grating in the morning stillness. They were an extension of Jason's personality, loud, intrusive, and deliberately cruel to anyone Jason deemed beneath notice. Their yellow construction vests and mud-caked boots marked them as outsiders in the predominantly military community of Riverdale, but Jason's father's construction company had enough local contracts that they couldn't be entirely shunned. "I don't understand why Jack keeps her around," Jason said loudly, ensuring his voice carried to Eleanor at the coffee station. "I mean, look at her. Customers have to stare at that while they eat. Bad for business." Frank Dawson's knuckles whitened around his coffee cup, his face flushing with anger, but Martha placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Don't make trouble, Frank," she whispered, though her own expression showed she shared his disgust. "It's not worth it." From the kitchen doorway, Samuel Sarge Williams observed the scene with narrowed eyes. The 72-year-old former Marine Corps cook had worked at Victory Diner almost as long as the owner. His massive frame filled the service window as he placed up an order, the movement causing his shirt to lift slightly, revealing the pearl handle of an M1911 pistol tucked into his waistband. His gaze lingered on Jason and his crew before shifting to Eleanor, a mixture of protective fury and respect in his eyes. Jack Miller, 75, emerged from his office at the back of the diner, drawn by the increasing volume. The owner of Victory Diner moved with the slight limp of someone who had ejected from a helicopter once too often during his years as a Huey pilot in Desert Storm. His weathered face betrayed little emotion as he surveyed his establishment, noting the tension but choosing not to intervene yet. His relationship with Eleanor had always been professional but distant. He knew she was former military, recognized the signs immediately when she applied 3 years ago, but he respected her privacy enough not to pry. When Eleanor had first appeared in Riverdale, she had been even more withdrawn than now, renting a small apartment above the hardware store, speaking only when necessary, revealing nothing about her past. The town had stories, of course, small towns always did, but the whispers about the Angel Team, an all-female special unit that supposedly operated during Desert Storm, were dismissed as military urban legend. No official record confirmed their existence, and Eleanor never acknowledged the rumors one way or another. Rick Cooper had once glimpsed inside Eleanor's locker in the break room when she'd left it ajar, saw a worn KA bar knife, a Green Beret badge, and a tattered photograph with the inscription, "Valkyrie Team 1991, before she closed it with a speed that startled him. He never mentioned what he'd seen, but he treated her with the deference of a lower-ranking soldier to a superior officer from that day forward. For 3 hours, Thomas Reynolds sat nursing the same cup of coffee, making notes in a small leather-bound notebook. His observations were methodical and precise, the way Eleanor maintained situational awareness even while performing mundane tasks. The slight hesitation in her left arm, suggesting an old injury, the calloused ridges on her fingers visible when she handled money, characteristic of someone intimately familiar with firearms. His thoughts returned repeatedly to the Angel. He remembered the combat medic who had led the extraction team that saved his unit when they were ambushed outside Basra. The woman who had pulled him from a burning Humvee, who had administered field medicine under heavy fire, who had commanded the evacuation with the authority of a seasoned officer despite her technical rank. The woman who had thrown herself over him when the second IED detonated, taking shrapnel that should have ended his life. Thomas had nearly convinced himself to approach her, had actually begun to rise from his seat, when the bell chimed again with an aggressive jangle. Jason and his crew had returned from their smoke break, louder and more obnoxious than before, their presence filling the diner with a suffocating tension. But what Jason Miller didn't know was that he was disrespecting one of the most dangerous soldiers ever to serve in Operation Desert Storm, and 2 men in this diner were about to prove it. "Still hiding under those sleeves, monster lady," Jason called out as Eleanor approached with coffee. "It must be 100 degrees outside. What are you hiding, burns from a meth lab track marks? Or maybe you're just so ugly all over that you're doing us a favor." The diner fell silent, forks and knives stilling against plates. Thomas observed Eleanor's reaction with professional interest, the slight shift in her stance to a more defensive posture, the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes the way her right hand instinctively moved to where a sidearm would be carried in a tactical holster. These weren't the reactions of someone afraid. These were the measured responses of a trained operator assessing a threat. "Your coffee, sir," Eleanor said, her voice neutral and controlled as she refilled his cup with a steady hand. The deliberate courtesy seemed to infuriate Jason further, like a shark sensing blood in the water, but unable to locate its source. "You know what I think?" Jason continued, emboldened by her silence and the captive audience. "I think Jack only hired you because he feels sorry for you. Or maybe you've got something on him. No one would keep something like you around unless they had to." Frank Dawson pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the linoleum. "That's enough, Miller," he said, his voice carrying the command presence of a former Master Sergeant. "Show some respect or take your business elsewhere." Jason turned toward Frank, his expression darkening. "Stay out of this, old man. This is between me and Freddy Krueger's sister here." He turned back to Eleanor. "Does it bother you knowing everyone in this town thinks you're a freak? That mothers pull their children closer when you walk by? That men look away because they can't stand the sight of you?" The cruelty hung in the air like poison gas seeping into every corner of the diner. Thomas Reynolds watched as Eleanor's professional mask remained firmly in place, though he could see the cost of that control in the whitening of her knuckles around the coffee pot. What struck him wasn't her restraint, impressive as it was, but the complete absence of surprise or hurt in her expression. This wasn't new territory for her. It was a battlefield she had navigated countless times. Jason reached into his wallet with theatrical flair, pulling out a $5 bill and deliberately dropping it onto the floor at Eleanor's feet. "There's your tip, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Pick it up. Maybe save up for some plastic surgery, though. I doubt they make anything strong enough for whatever horror show you're hiding." The bill fluttered to the grimy linoleum like a dead leaf, and the entire diner seemed to hold its breath as Eleanor looked down at it. The morning sun slanted through the diner's windows, casting long shadows that seemed to divide the room into territories. The bright spaces where normal life continued, and the darker corners where old traumas lurked, waiting for moments like this to resurface. But 30 seconds from now, everyone in this diner would know they were standing in the presence of a forgotten military legend. Eleanor bent down slowly to retrieve the money, her movements careful and deliberate, each action measured, as if performing a drill that had been practiced thousands of times. It was as she straightened that Jason made his fatal error, the moment that would change everything in ways none of them could have anticipated. Whether from malice or simple carelessness, his hand shot out as she rose, shoving her shoulder hard enough to send her stumbling sideways. The violent motion caused her carefully maintained appearance to unravel as her uniform shirt pulled loose from her waist and her sleeve rode up past her elbow. But it wasn't just the scars that were revealed in that moment of calculated cruelty. It was something else entirely. The tattoo stood out starkly against her scarred skin, military crisp and undeniably authentic. The winged emblem of the Valkyrie team wrapped around an image of a sword and medical caduceus with the words "Operation Desert Storm 1991" beneath it. The scars themselves told their own story, a horrific narrative written in damaged flesh that spoke of extreme heat and violence, tissue that had been burned and healed in ways that suggested not an accident, but sacrifice. The entire diner could see it now, this glimpse into a hidden history that transformed their perception in an instant. One of the younger customers, a college student home for summer break, whispered, "Holy shit, that's the Valkyrie tattoo. I wrote my thesis on that legendary unit." The atmosphere shifted palpably, like the air pressure dropping before a storm, as understanding began to dawn on some, while others remained locked in confusion. Jason, however, remained oblivious to the changing mood, too drunk on his own perceived power to notice the way Thomas had risen from his booth, or how other patrons were now looking at Eleanor with something approaching awe rather than pity or disgust. "Oh, this is rich," Jason laughed, pointing at the exposed tattoo. "Look at this, boys. She's playing soldier now. What did you do? Buy that fake tattoo online, trying to get sympathy by pretending to be a veteran?" His laughter was harsh and grating, echoing off the diner's walls like breaking glass. "I've seen this before. These stolen valor types who buy military gear at surplus stores and pretend they served. Pathetic. As if anyone would believe someone like you actually served our country." Eleanor stood frozen, her shirt still disheveled, the tattoo and scars fully visible now under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her face had gone pale beneath her carefully maintained composure, and for the first time since the confrontation began, real emotion flickered across her features. Not hurt or anger at Jason's words, but something deeper and more complex. It was the look of someone whose most private pain had been forcibly exposed, whose carefully constructed walls had been breached by casual cruelty. Her hand moved unconsciously to pull down her sleeve, but stopped midway as if she realized the futility of trying to hide what had already been seen. The silence in the diner had become complete, even the coffee machine's usual gurgle seeming to pause in respect for the moment's gravity. Thomas Reynolds had crossed half the distance to their table before he even realized he was moving his chair, clattering to the floor behind him in his haste. His eyes were fixed on that tattoo with an intensity that bordered on religious revelation, his mind racing through memories and possibilities with the speed of automatic weapons fire. Every detail he could see confirmed what his heart had been telling him for the past 3 hours. The way she moved, the careful control, the specific design of that unit insignia that couldn't be faked because it had never been officially acknowledged. His hand shook as he reached into his jacket pocket, fingertips brushing against the photograph he'd carried for 34 years, like a talisman against forgetting. The moment crystallized around him, past and present, colliding with the force of an IED explosion, and suddenly he could smell cordite and burning fuel mixed with the mundane scents of coffee and bacon grease. Thomas's approach was that of a man walking through a dream, each step careful and deliberate, as if the floor might give way beneath him at any moment. His eyes remained locked on the tattoo on the familiar insignia that had marked his own memories since that night in the Iraqi desert. The coffee cup in his hand clattered against a table as he passed the sound sharp in the preternatural quiet that had descended over Victory Diner. "Valkyrie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the silence. "Valkyrie Team 5. He stopped 3 feet from Eleanor, close enough to see the way her eyes had gone wide with something between fear and recognition, far enough to give her space to retreat if she chose. "Iraq, 1991, he continued, each word carefully chosen a password to a shared experience that only 2 people in that diner could fully understand. Eleanor's reaction was immediate and visceral, her body tensing as if preparing for impact, her eyes darting to the exits like a trapped animal seeking escape routes. But there was something else there too. A flicker of recognition that she couldn't quite hide despite years of practice at concealing her emotions. "Oh my God," Thomas breathed, and now his voice carried the weight of certainty of puzzle pieces clicking into place with audible finality. "Sergeant Rogers, Eleanor Rogers." The names fell from his lips like a prayer answered after years of doubt. His hands moved unconsciously to his chest, fingers tracing the outline of scars hidden beneath his shirt. Scars that matched hers in their origin, if not their severity. "You're the one," he said, voice thick with emotion. "You're the one who pulled me out of that burning Humvee." The statement wasn't a question, but a declaration, a truth so profound that it seemed to alter the very air in the diner. "I've been sitting here for 3 hours because I thought I was seeing ghosts," he continued. "I've been carrying your picture for 34 years, searching every VA hospital, every veterans gathering, every online forum, and here you are serving coffee in a diner in the middle of nowhere." Eleanor's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. The coffee pot in her hands crashed to the floor with a sound like artillery in the quiet space. Cups shattered, silverware scattered, and coffee spread across the linoleum in a dark pool that nobody moved to clean. She stumbled backward, her hand reaching for the counter to steady herself as her legs threatened to give way. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in denial of what her eyes were telling her. "You're supposed to be. They told me you didn't make it. They said the injuries were too severe that you died in Germany." Her voice broke on the last word, years of guilt and grief pouring through the cracks in her professional facade. "I thought I failed you. All these years I thought I failed to save you." Tears tracked down her cheeks, unchecked, each one a testament to nights spent reliving those moments, wondering if she could have done more, moved faster, been better. The revelation rippled through the diner like a shockwave, touching each person differently, but affecting all profoundly. Jason's laughter died in his throat, his smirk fading as even his limited intelligence began to grasp that something significant was happening, something that relegated his petty cruelties to the insignificance they deserved. His crew exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of genuine emotion and history that dwarfed their small-minded games. Frank Dawson clutched Martha's hand, the woman's eyes bright with unshed tears, as she whispered something about their own son who had served. The college student had lowered his phone, the urge to record seemingly forgotten in the face of something too profound for social media. Even Samuel had emerged fully from the kitchen, his bulk filling the doorway as he watched the scene unfold with the attention of someone witnessing history. Alive, Thomas confirmed, his voice stronger, now filled with the kind of emotion that comes from gratitude, so deep it has no adequate expression. Because of you, you ran into hell itself to pull me out. When everyone else was running away from the fire, you ran toward it. He took a step closer, his movements careful and non-threatening, aware that he was approaching someone who had been living with invisible wounds for nearly 3 decades. They told me a female soldier saved my life, but in the chaos afterward, I lost track. They shipped me to Germany, then Walter Reed. Months of surgeries and recovery. By the time I could ask questions, you were gone. They said you'd been discharged, disappeared into civilian life. His hand went to his pocket, pulling out the photograph with reverent care. This is all I had. This picture from before that night, and the memory of someone refusing to leave me behind. Eleanor's gaze fixed on the photograph, her breath catching as she recognized faces from another lifetime. Young soldiers grinning at the camera with the confidence of those who hadn't yet learned the true cost of war. Her finger traced the air above one face in particular, a young man whose features bore enough resemblance to the one standing before her to confirm what her heart already knew. Rodriguez didn't make it, she said quietly, naming another face in the photo. Neither did Thompson. I tried. God, I tried to get everyone out, but the second IED... Her voice cracked, unable to finish the sentence that had haunted her dreams for 34 years. The weight of survivor's guilt was evident in every line of her body, the burden of being the one who lived when others didn't. The curse of memory that never faded no matter how many coffee cups she filled or tables she cleaned. The atmosphere in the diner had transformed completely, the very air seeming to thicken with the weight of shared history and unspoken sacrifice. Customers who had entered seeking nothing more than breakfast and coffee found themselves witnesses to something far more profound. A reunion that spoke to the bonds forged in combat, the debts that could never be repaid, and the healing that sometimes comes from simply knowing that your sacrifice mattered. The morning sun streaming through the windows seemed to spotlight the two veterans, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like bridges between past and present. In that moment, Victory Diner had become something more than a roadside restaurant. It had become a place where hidden heroism was revealed and where the true cost of freedom was written in scars both visible and invisible. But before the diner could fully process what was happening, the bell above the door jangled with violent urgency. All eyes turned to see Rick Cooper rushing back in, his face flushed with excitement and purpose. I called Fort Campbell, he announced, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. General Hargrove is on his way. I told him we found one of the Valkyries. At the mention of that name, Eleanor swayed slightly, her hand gripping the counter with white knuckles. Thomas moved to her side, not touching her, but close enough to steady her if needed. I never thought I'd hear that name spoken out loud again. She whispered, her eyes meeting his with a mix of terror and resignation. They promised us no one would ever know, that it never happened. What never happened? Jason asked, his voice smaller now, uncertainty creeping in as he sensed the ground shifting beneath his feet. What the hell is a Valkyrie? Thomas turned to face him, his posture straightening into military bearing, his voice taking on the crisp authority of the lieutenant colonel he had once been. The Valkyries were the most classified special operations unit in Desert Storm, he said, each word measured and precise. An experimental all-female combat team that officially never existed. And you've been mocking their team leader for the past 3 years. The diner seemed frozen in a tableau of shock and revelation. Eleanor's exposed tattoo gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the winged Valkyrie emblem, a stark declaration of identity she had hidden for decades. Her scarred arm trembled slightly as she continued to grip the counter for support, torn between the instinct to cover herself and the sudden, overwhelming realization that her secret was now irrevocably exposed. Jason Miller's face had drained of color, his earlier arrogance replaced by confusion as he tried to process Thomas's words. His construction crew shifted uncomfortably behind him, suddenly interested in their coffee cups and plates, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the diner. "Pick it up," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable tone of command. Jason blinked, not understanding. "What?" "The money, on the floor." Eleanor pointed to the $5 bill still lying where Jason had thrown it. "You dropped it. Pick it up." There was no anger in her voice, no emotion at all, just the flat expectation of compliance that came from someone accustomed to being obeyed. The reversal of power was so complete and unexpected that Jason found himself bending down, automatically retrieving the bill with fumbling fingers. "Now put it in the tip jar," she continued in the same measured tone. "Please." The please wasn't a request, but a formality, a courtesy extended by someone who didn't need to ask but chose to anyway. Jason moved to the counter like a sleepwalker and dropped the money into the jar, his earlier bravado entirely evaporated. The college student who had recognized the tattoo had pulled out his phone again, this time not to record but to search. His fingers flew over the screen as he pulled up information. "I can't believe it," he whispered excitedly to no one in particular. The Valkyries were rumored to be an experimental all-female combat unit in Desert Storm, but the Pentagon has always denied they existed. There's nothing but forum posts and conspiracy theories online, but they were real. He turned the phone toward an older man sitting nearby, showing him the screen. "Look, there are stories about an angel team that rescued a special forces unit trapped behind enemy lines. Is that?" He looked up at Eleanor with newfound awe. Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "First Sergeant Eleanor Rogers, call sign Angel, combat medic specialist and team leader of Valkyrie 5. The woman who saved not just me but 16 other men during the most classified rescue operation of the entire Gulf War." A flush of embarrassment spread across Eleanor's cheeks as she finally managed to pull her sleeve back down, covering the evidence of her past. "That was a long time ago," she said softly. "Another life." "Not to me," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about the soldier who pulled me from that burning Humvee, who went back for the others when she could have saved herself, who took shrapnel meant for me." The diner had become utterly silent, every patron transfixed by the unfolding scene. Frank Dawson sat with his mouth slightly open, his coffee forgotten. Martha dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Even Samuel had emerged fully from the kitchen, dish towel still in his massive hands, watching with the intensity of a fellow warrior recognizing one of his own. "It was just outside Basra." Thomas began his gaze distant now as he slipped into the past. "February 2071. My unit was on a classified intelligence gathering mission. We were supposed to be gathering intel on Iraqi troop movements, but we walked into an ambush." The words transported the diner patrons to another time and place. The mundane surroundings of Victory Diner faded as Thomas's voice painted images of desert heat and violence with the vivid clarity of someone who had lived through horror and never forgotten a detail. "We were in 3 Humvees, standard patrol formation. Rodriguez was driving, Point Thompson on the 50 cal. It was 120 degrees, nothing but sand and hostility as far as the eye could see. The first IED took out our lead vehicle, flipped a 9,000-pound armored Humvee like it was a toy." Thomas paused, swallowing hard against the memory. His eyes found Eleanor seeking permission to continue telling her story. She gave him a barely perceptible nod. Permission granted. The blast killed Rodriguez instantly. Thompson was thrown clear but unconscious, bleeding from a head wound. "I was trapped inside. The door frame twisted like a pretzel, jamming it shut. Fire was already spreading from the ruptured fuel tank." The college student had stopped typing on his phone, the screen forgotten as he listened with rapt attention. Martha had reached for Frank's hand, their fingers intertwining an unspoken understanding of what it meant to serve and to wait at home. "Have you ever felt your skin beginning to blister while you're still conscious?" Thomas asked the question, rhetorical but affecting nonetheless. "Have you ever smelled your own flesh cooking? Have you ever known with absolute certainty that you're about to die badly and there's nothing you can do about it except scream and pray for it to be quick?" Jason flinched visibly at the graphic description, his earlier mockery of Eleanor's scars returning to haunt him with vivid context. "That's when she appeared. Thomas continued, his voice taking on a reverent quality. First Sergeant Eleanor Rogers, team leader of the Valkyrie unit. She was supposed to be miles away with her unit waiting for extraction orders. But somehow she heard our distress call. Somehow she convinced her team to divert from their mission to save a bunch of men they'd never met. Thomas turned to face Eleanor, directly speaking to her now rather than about her. You had nothing but your bare hands and a combat knife. No special equipment, no protective gear. Just determination I've never seen matched before or since. You broke through that window and dragged 200 pounds of soldier and gear to safety while ammunition was cooking off from the heat. Eleanor's composure was crumbling with each word, years of carefully constructed defenses falling away as the truth she had carried alone for so long was finally spoken aloud. Tears tracked silently down her cheeks, but she made no move to wipe them away. Standing straighter now, shoulders back, accepting both the recognition and the pain that came with it. But that's not all, Thomas continued. No one in this room knows what happened next, what the Pentagon classified so deeply that it was scrubbed from official records. The tension in the diner had become almost unbearable. Every person leaned forward, slightly caught in the gravitational pull of a story that challenged everything they thought they knew about military history and the woman who had been serving them coffee for 3 years. The second IED detonated, Thomas said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing absolute silence as everyone strained to hear. Positioned specifically to catch first responders, a tactic the insurgents had perfected. Eleanor saw it coming, that split second of recognition that comes from training and experience. And instead of diving for cover like any sane person would do, she threw her body over mine. He had to stop swallowing hard against the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him even after 34 years. His fingers traced unconsciously over his chest, where his own scars lay hidden beneath his shirt. The blast should have killed us both instantly. Would have if she hadn't made herself a human shield, taking the shrapnel and debris and superheated gases into her own body to protect mine. By the time the quick reaction force arrived, she was unconscious, her back and arms a mess of burns and embedded metal that looked like something from a horror movie. The revelation hung in the air, transforming the diner into sacred space. Eleanor's scars were no longer marks of shame to be hidden and mocked, but badges of honor earned through extraordinary sacrifice. 17 Shaya, Thomas said, the number hanging in the air like a verdict. That's the number you need to understand. 17 soldiers are breathing today, seeing their families living their lives because Eleanor Rogers repeatedly chose others' lives over her own safety. 17 families didn't get folded flags and carefully worded condolence letters because she wouldn't leave anyone behind, even when doctrine said to preserve medical personnel for future casualties. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound in the diner was the soft sobbing of Martha Dawson and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, marking the passage of ordinary time in a moment that had become anything but ordinary. Bronze Star for Valor. Thomas continued, his voice gaining strength again. Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. Combat Medical Badge, with star denoting participation in ground combat. Meritorious Service Medal. He paused, looking directly at Jason Miller. And what did she ask her in return? Nothing. What recognition did she seek? None. She disappeared into civilian life, carrying those scars inside and out, working in this diner, serving coffee to people who called her monster, who mocked her appearance, who threw money on the floor like she was beneath their contempt. Jason seemed to physically shrink with each word, his face flushing with shame as the magnitude of his cruelty was laid bare before everyone. His crew had moved several steps away from him, no longer willing to be associated with his actions. And you, Coy, Thomas continued, turning his full attention to Jason. You dare to call her Freddy Krueger. You dare to question her service. You throw $5 on the floor and tell her to buy scar cream for wounds she received, saving lives that you aren't worthy to polish the boots of. The digital age had arrived in Victory Diner with a vengeance. Smartphones had appeared throughout the diner, their cameras capturing every word of Thomas's testimony and Jason's increasingly pale face as he realized the magnitude of his error. This is going viral, someone whispered from a back table. 10,000 watching on my stream right now. It's spreading across platforms like wildfire. That's Hillcrest Construction on his shirt, another voice added. I just tagged their corporate account and their leadership team. The interconnected world had made the diner's walls transparent, transforming a local incident into a globally witnessed moment of reckoning that would follow Jason Miller for the rest of his life. Jason's phone began buzzing insistently in his pocket, the screen lighting up with notification after notification in a cascade of digital doom. His face, already pale from Thomas's words, went ashen as he glimpsed the caller ID showing his father's name. Then his supervisor, then numbers he didn't recognize that were probably reporters or angry citizens who had found his information online. The phone continued to ring, joined by text message alerts and social media notifications, in a symphony of impending consequence that grew louder with each passing second. "My dad," he whispered, the words barely audible over the electronic noise. "Oh God, my dad is calling." But the crowd that had formed between him and the exit wasn't interested in his suddenly urgent need to deal with the consequences of his actions. Their faces reflected the collective decision that he would face the music here in front of everyone, in front of her, who was calling Jason's phone over and over again. The answer was becoming clear as comments flooded in on the live streams, spreading across the internet like digital wildfire. His employer, his colleagues, reporters from local news stations, veterans organizations, and soon everyone who mattered in his life would know exactly what kind of man he was. Jack Miller, the owner of Victory Diner, pushed through the kitchen doors with the force of a man who had heard enough to understand that his establishment had become ground zero for something far beyond a simple customer dispute. A Gulf War veteran himself, though he rarely spoke of it beyond the faded Air Force wings tattooed on his forearm, Jack's expression reflected fury mixed with personal shame. He took in the scene with a single sweeping glance. Eleanor, standing exposed with her scars visible to all, tears still tracking down her face. Thomas, trembling with righteous anger, and Jason desperately trying to silence his constantly ringing phone while the crowd blocked his escape. "What in the hell is going on in my diner?" Jack's voice carried the authority of someone who had given orders under fire, transforming his question into a demand for immediate answers. One of the live streaming customers thrust their phone toward him, showing him a replay of the confrontation that had already been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Jack's expression darkened with each passing second, his jaw clenching as he watched his employee being humiliated and assaulted. "Miller," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "get out of my establishment now, and if I see you within 100 yards of this place again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing and assault. Move!" But Jason's path was blocked by customers who had formed a human barrier, their faces reflecting collective anger. "My phone," Jason stammered, looking at the screen where his father's name flashed urgently. "I need to answer." The crowd wasn't interested in his excuse. "Answer it here," someone demanded. "Put it on speaker. Let's all hear what Hillcrest Construction thinks about their foreman now." With shaking hands, Jason accepted the call and fumbled with the speaker button. His father's voice exploded into the diner. "Jason, what the hell have you done? We've got thousands of messages flooding every channel. Our website crashed and there are news vans heading to the office right now. The mayor called me personally. Do you understand? You're fired, effective immediately. Security will box up your things. Don't come to the property. Don't list us as a reference. And Jason, you better pray this doesn't escalate to legal action." The line went dead, leaving Jason standing there with the phone still pressed to his ear, his face drained of all color as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him like a collapsing building. Eleanor found her voice for the first time since Thomas had revealed her past. "I didn't want this," she said, her words measured and careful. "I just wanted to serve coffee in peace, to live a quiet life where my past didn't define every interaction." She looked directly at Thomas, and her voice softened with emotion. "I thought about you every single day, every nightmare, every time I looked in the mirror. I thought about how I failed to save Rodriguez, how Thompson died despite everything I tried." Her voice broke on the names. "I'm sorry I couldn't save them all. I'm sorry I wasn't faster, stronger, better." Thomas crossed the space between them in two strides, his arms enveloping Eleanor in an embrace that spoke of shared trauma and complicated gratitude. "You saved who you could," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's everything. I've searched for 34 years to say thank you, to tell you that my daughters exist because of you." They clung to each other while the diner erupted in spontaneous applause, the sound building from scattered claps to thunderous appreciation. Even Jason's crew members, abandoned by their leader, joined in the applause, perhaps finally understanding the gravity of what they had witnessed. The door to the diner banged open again, and the crowd parted as uniformed military personnel entered. Leading them was a tall, distinguished man with the stars of a major general gleaming on his shoulders. General William Hargrove, commander of Fort Campbell, moved with purpose, his aides forming a protective formation around him. The general stopped 3 paces from Eleanor and Thomas, taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent a lifetime evaluating tactical situations. His gaze lingered on Eleanor's exposed tattoo, then moved to her face, recognition dawning in his eyes. "First Sergeant Rogers," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command and something else, profound respect. "I thought you were just a legend they told new recruits to inspire them." Eleanor straightened instinctively at the presence of a superior officer, her posture shifting automatically into attention despite the decades since she had stood on a parade ground. "Sir," she acknowledged, simply, her voice steady once more. General Hargrove's next action shocked everyone in the diner. He came to rigid attention and saluted Eleanor with parade ground precision. "First Sergeant Eleanor Rogers, Valkyrie Team 5, he said formally. "On behalf of the United States Army, it is my profound honor to meet you." The salute held unwavering until Eleanor returned it with the muscle memory of someone for whom such protocols had once been as natural as breathing. The exchange lasted only seconds, but communicated volumes about respect, recognition, and the unbreakable bonds of service. As the general lowered his hand, he turned to address the diner at large. "What is about to happen here is still technically classified," he said, his tone making it clear that he was about to ignore that fact. "But I believe the time for secrecy has passed." He nodded to one of his aides, who produced a tablet and began typing rapidly. "I've just received authorization from the Pentagon to acknowledge the existence of Operation Valkyrie, effective immediately," Hargrove continued. "The records will be declassified and the contributions of First Sergeant Rogers and her team will finally be officially recognized." The general turned back to Eleanor, his expression softening slightly. "We've been searching for you for years, First Sergeant. After the explosion, you were evacuated to Germany, then stateside for treatment. By the time the Pentagon realized what had happened, you had been discharged and disappeared. Your records were sealed at the highest levels, and the entire operation was classified. Even I only heard rumors until this morning." Eleanor's expression remained carefully neutral, though her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. "They told me Lieutenant Reynolds hadn't made it," she said quietly, "that the mission was classified and would never be acknowledged, that I was being medically discharged and should never speak of what happened." "A convenient lie," Hargrove replied grimly. "The Pentagon wasn't ready to acknowledge that women had served in direct combat roles. It was politically expedient to bury the truth rather than explain why an all-female combat unit had been deployed decades before such service was officially permitted. Your unit was ahead of its time, First Sergeant, too far ahead for the military bureaucracy to handle." The revelation sent murmurs rippling through the diner. Women had only been officially allowed in combat roles in 2015, more than 2 decades after Eleanor and her team had apparently served with distinction in one of the most dangerous missions of Desert Storm. "But that's not the whole story, is it?" Thomas interjected, his voice carrying an edge of long, restrained anger. "Tell them about the mission, General. Tell them what they were really doing there. Tell them why it was so classified that they erased an entire unit from history." Hargrove's expression hardened slightly. "Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds, some aspects remain classified even now." "With all due respect, sir," Thomas pressed, "they classified it to hide their mistake, not to protect national security. Eleanor deserves better than that. They all do." The tension between the two men crackled in the air, decades of institutional secrecy colliding with the personal need for truth and recognition. Eleanor watched the exchange with growing apprehension, her hand unconsciously moving to cover her scarred arm once more. But before Hargrove could respond, the college student who had been researching on his phone spoke up. "Sir, I'm finding references online now. The Pentagon appears to be releasing information already. Something called Operation Phantom Rescue, February 27, 91. Hargrove's head snapped toward the young man. "What?" The student held up his phone, showing a breaking news alert. "It's hitting all the major networks now. Pentagon acknowledges classified all-female combat unit from Gulf War. Records to be unsealed after 34 years of secrecy. The general's face registered a complex mixture of emotions, surprise, resignation, and finally a grudging admiration. He turned to his aide. "Did you do this?" The aide shook his head. "No, sir. This is coming directly from the Secretary of Defense. It appears the live streams from this diner reached someone with enough authority to fast-track the declassification." Hargrove took a moment to process this information, then nodded decisively. "Well, then it seems the truth is finally going to see daylight." He turned back to Eleanor. "First Sergeant Rogers, your unit was part of a highly classified operation to rescue intelligence assets deep behind enemy lines. What Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds and his team didn't know was that they had stumbled upon something the Iraqi military was desperate to keep hidden. When they were ambushed, the real target wasn't them, but the intelligence they had accidentally discovered. The diner had fallen completely silent again, every person present aware they were witnessing the revelation of a piece of hidden history. Your team," Hargrove continued, addressing Eleanor directly, "was the only asset we had close enough to attempt a rescue before the intelligence was lost forever. You weren't just saving soldiers, you were retrieving critical information that directly contributed to ending the war with minimal coalition casualties." Eleanor swayed slightly at this revelation, her hand finding the counter once more for support. "We were never told," she whispered. "They just said, 'Get in, get the men, get out.' We didn't know." "That was intentional," Hargrove confirmed. "The fewer people who knew the true objective, the better. But your actions that day saved not only 17 American lives, but potentially thousands more, by helping to bring the conflict to a swifter conclusion." Jason Miller still stood frozen near the door, forgotten in the wake of these larger revelations. His phone had finally stopped ringing, the battery apparently dead from the constant notifications. He used the distraction to edge closer to the exit, desperate to escape the scene of his humiliation. But Eleanor noticed his movement. "Wait," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs that had filled the diner. "Let him go." All eyes turned to her in surprise. "He didn't know," she continued simply. "None of you did. That was the point. I chose to live quietly to keep my past to myself. I can't blame him for not recognizing something I had deliberately concealed." The generosity of spirit in her words silenced the room once more. Even Jason paused, his hand on the door, looking back at her with disbelief. "I didn't hide my scars because I was ashamed of them," Eleanor explained, rolling up her sleeve again to fully reveal the damaged tissue. "I hid them because every time someone saw them, they asked questions I couldn't answer. Every time someone thanked me for my service, I had to lie by omission. It was easier to be the monster, the freak, than to carry the weight of a truth I wasn't allowed to share." No one knew what to say to that. The vulnerability and strength contained in those words created a silence that felt almost holy, a recognition of a burden few could comprehend. Thomas moved to stand beside her, his presence an anchor in the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "You're not alone anymore," he said softly, for her ears only. "You never have to carry this alone again." General Hargrove cleared his throat, reclaiming attention. "First Sergeant Rogers, in light of the declassification, I believe there's something long overdue." He turned to another aide who stepped forward with a polished wooden box. "With the authority vested in me as commander of Fort Campbell, I am hereby informing you that the Department of Defense will be formally recognizing your service in the service of the Valkyrie unit in an official ceremony. The records will be corrected and the awards and decorations you and your team earned will be properly presented." He opened the box to reveal a gleaming medal, the Silver Star, the nation's third highest award for valor in combat. "This is just the beginning," Hargrove continued. "The full review of your actions may well result in the Medal of Honor, but that will take time. For now, please accept this as a down payment on a debt that can never truly be repaid." Eleanor stared at the medal, her expression unreadable. 34 years of silence and secrecy collapsing into this single shining moment of recognition. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Rodriguez, Thompson, Martinez, Nguyen, Chen." She named each fallen comrade from memory, their faces clear in her mind despite the decades. "This belongs to them as much as to me. They never came home to receive their recognition. And they will be honored alongside you," Hargrove promised. "Every member of Valkyrie team, living or fallen, will finally receive the recognition they deserve." But what no one in the diner yet realized was that the true story of the Valkyrie team was even more extraordinary than they imagined. The Pentagon wasn't just declassifying their existence, they were revealing a chapter of military history that would rewrite the understanding of women's roles in combat decades before official policy acknowledged their contributions. The revelation that would follow would shock the nation and transform Eleanor from a scarred waitress in a small-town diner to a symbol of unrecognized courage and sacrifice across America. The rumble of military vehicles outside Victory Diner grew louder as more personnel arrived. The morning sun glinted off polished insignia as officers in dress uniform entered, followed by aides carrying briefcases and communication equipment. What had begun as a routine morning in a small-town establishment was transforming into something that resembled a military command post. General Hargrove conferred quietly with his staff in the corner, while Eleanor stood surrounded by Thomas Reynolds and Jack Miller, both men positioned protectively at her sides. The Silver Star medal remained in its open box on the counter, untouched its polished surface, catching the light each time someone moved near it. Jason Miller had slipped out during the commotion, his construction crew following shortly after their earlier swagger, replaced by a subdued embarrassment. The diner's regular customers remained joined now by curious townspeople who had heard something extraordinary was happening at Victory Diner. Smartphones continued to record the live feeds, reaching an audience that now numbered in the millions. The bell above the door jangled once more as a tall, imposing figure in civilian clothes entered. The military personnel immediately straightened, and General Hargrove moved forward to greet the newcomer. "Mr. Secretary," Hargrove said, extending his hand, "I didn't expect you to come personally." The Secretary of Defense, Carlton Hayes, shook the offered hand firmly. "When the President called me about a viral video showing one of our most classified Cold War operations being exposed in a diner, I decided this warranted direct attention." His gaze moved past Hargrove to find Eleanor. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by something that might have been regret. "First Sergeant Rogers," he said, his voice carrying easily through the now silent diner. "The last time I saw you was in a field hospital outside Riyadh. You were barely alive. The doctors didn't think you'd make it through the night." Eleanor stiffened, her expression carefully neutral. "Sir." The secretary moved toward her with measured steps, conscious of the attention focused on him. "I was a major then attached to intelligence. I was there to debrief the survivors and secure the intelligence your team recovered. I was also the one who recommended your operation be classified at the highest level." A murmur ran through the diner at this admission. Eleanor's face remained impassive, but Thomas tensed beside her, his hand unconsciously clenching into a fist. "Why?" Thomas demanded, military protocol momentarily forgotten in the face of decades of enforced silence. "Why erase them from history? Why deny them the recognition they earned?" The secretary didn't flinch at the accusation in Thomas's voice. He looked tired, the weight of decisions made long ago still evident in the lines of his face. Because in 1991, women were explicitly barred from combat roles by both military regulation and public law. He explained, addressing his words to everyone in the diner. The Valkyrie program was authorized as a classified exception and experimental unit to assess the viability of women in special operations. It was never meant to see actual combat. They were supposed to be training only a proof of concept for future policy changes. He turned back to Eleanor. But when Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds' team was ambushed with critical intelligence, there was no time to deploy conventional forces. Valkyrie Team 5 was the only asset within range that could execute the rescue and secure the intel before it was lost. The decision to deploy them was made at the highest levels, with the understanding that it could never be publicly acknowledged. "So you erased us," Eleanor said quietly. "You erased our service, our sacrifice. You told me my team died for nothing." The secretary had the grace to look ashamed. "It was wrong. I've known it was wrong for 34 years. But at the time, the alternative seemed worse. If the deployment of Valkyrie had become public, there would have been congressional investigations, policy battles, potential legal actions. The entire program would have been shut down, and the progress toward eventually allowing women in combat roles would have been set back decades. Frank Dawson, who had been listening intently from his table, spoke up. "So you sacrificed their recognition to protect the politics." It wasn't a question, and the secretary didn't treat it as one. "Yes, and I've regretted it every day since. When I became secretary 2 years ago, I began the process of declassifying the Valkyrie program. The paperwork has been moving through channels, but bureaucracy is slow. Until this morning, when the president called me about a viral video from a diner in Tennessee, he gestured toward the phone still recording the conversation. Sometimes social media accomplishes what official channels cannot. The story is out now beyond anyone's ability to contain it. The president has authorized immediate declassification of all records related to Operation Valkyrie and the deployment of female combat personnel during Desert Storm. The secretary turned back to Eleanor, his expression solemn. First Sergeant Rogers, on behalf of the United States government and the Department of Defense, I offer you a formal apology for the silence that was imposed on you and your team. What should have been recognized as one of the most courageous acts in modern military history was instead buried in classified files and denied even to the families of those who fell. Eleanor stood perfectly still, processing his words. 3 decades of carrying a burden no one was allowed to acknowledge, of believing her greatest sacrifice had gone unrecognized, of thinking the man she had saved had died despite her efforts, all of it culminating in this moment of official recognition. I don't want your apology, she said finally, her voice steady and clear. I want justice for my team. I want their families to know how their daughters, sisters, and mothers died. I want Rodriguez's parents to know that their son died a hero and that I did everything possible to save him. I want Thompson's widow to know that his last words were about her. The emotion in her voice silenced the room. Even the secretary seemed momentarily at a loss for words. You'll have it, he promised eventually. All of it. Their records will be corrected, their families notified personally. Their sacrifices will be honored publicly and without reservation. And yours, First Sergeant. The nation owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid, but we can begin by telling the truth. Thomas moved closer to Eleanor, his presence a reminder that she wasn't facing this alone anymore. There's something else, he said, addressing the secretary. The intelligence we recovered that day. What was it? What was worth all those lives? The secretary exchanged a glance with General Hargrove, a silent communication passing between them. Hargrove nodded almost imperceptibly. Chemical weapons, the secretary said finally. Your team discovered evidence of a previously unknown chemical weapons facility near Basra. The intelligence you gathered allowed coalition forces to neutralize the threat before those weapons could be deployed against our troops or civilian populations. You saved thousands of lives, maybe tens of thousands, though you never knew it. Eleanor's legs finally gave way beneath her, the weight of this revelation too much to bear standing. Thomas caught her arm, guiding her to a nearby chair as the full impact of what she'd been part of washed over her. All these years, she whispered, I thought we failed. I thought I failed. You didn't fail, Thomas assured her, kneeling beside her chair. You succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Your team accomplished the mission to save my unit and helped end the war sooner than it might have otherwise. You're the reason I came home to meet my wife, to have my daughters, to live these past 34 years. A heavy silence filled the diner as everyone present absorbed the magnitude of what had been revealed. The weight of history hung in the air, along with the dawning realization that the woman who had served them coffee, whom they had dismissed or pitied or mocked, was in fact a hero whose actions had saved countless lives. Valkyrie, Martha Dawson whispered from her seat, the word carrying in the quiet diner. In Norse mythology, they were the choosers of the slain, warrior women who determined who lived and who died in battle. She looked at Eleanor with newfound understanding. They chose who would go to Valhalla, to glory, a fitting name for women who went into combat to save others. Eleanor nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. Our commanding officer had a dark sense of humor, said if we were going to break all the rules about women in combat, we might as well embrace the warrior goddess archetype. Valkyrie wasn't just a unit designation, the secretary added, seeing an opportunity to provide context. It was one of the most selective special operations programs ever created. Women from all branches of service, chosen for exceptional physical abilities, combat skills, and specialized expertise. They underwent training equivalent to Delta Force or SEAL Team 6, but in absolute secrecy. He turned to address the wider audience in the diner. Each Valkyrie had at least 2 critical skill sets. First Sergeant Rogers was a combat medic and close quarters combat specialist. Lieutenant Ramirez was a sniper and linguist. Captain O'Neill was a trauma surgeon and explosives expert. The idea was to create a unit that could operate independently in hostile territory with minimal support and maximum effectiveness. Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of her former teammates. "They're alive, Ramirez and O'Neill." The secretary nodded. "Yes, and Coleman and Jackson, too. Like you, they were discharged quietly, their records sealed. They've been living civilian lives carrying the same burden of silence you have." The news seemed to hit Eleanor with physical force. She leaned forward, her voice urgent. "Where are they now? Do they know about this?" "They're being notified as we speak," the secretary confirmed. "Ramirez is a congresswoman from Arizona now. O'Neill is a trauma surgeon in Chicago. Coleman works for a defense contractor in Virginia, and Jackson teaches high school in Oregon." A soft gasp escaped Eleanor. "Maria Ramirez is in Congress. She always said she'd change the system from within." "She's been on the Armed Services Committee for 6 years," the secretary said with a slight smile. "Ironically, she's been one of the strongest advocates for women in combat roles, though she could never reveal her own experience as the basis for her position." On television screens throughout the diner, the small set over the counter, and the phones in people's hands, news broadcasts were beginning to pick up the story. The chyron on the national news channel read, "Breaking Pentagon confirms secret all-female combat unit in Gulf War." A reporter stood outside the Pentagon speaking rapidly as military officials hurried in and out of the building behind her. In what military historians are already calling one of the most significant revelations about modern warfare in decades, the reporter was saying the Department of Defense has confirmed the existence of a classified all-female special operations unit that operated during the 1991 Gulf War. The unit, codenamed Valkyrie, reportedly conducted combat operations more than 20 years before women were officially allowed in combat roles. The diner had become a strange intersection of history being made and history being revised. Locals who had come for breakfast were now witnesses to a national revelation, while military personnel coordinated a rapidly evolving situation from beside the coffee counter. General Hargrove was speaking quietly into a secure phone, nodding occasionally. He hung up and approached the secretary. "Sir, the White House is preparing a formal statement. They're requesting that First Sergeant Rogers, Master Sergeant Rogers, be present for a press conference this afternoon if she feels up to it." All eyes turned to Eleanor, who still seemed overwhelmed by the cascade of revelations. She looked up at Thomas, seeking something in his expression. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to," he told her quietly. "You've given enough." Eleanor took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders with the disciplined posture that had become second nature during her military service. "No, if they're finally telling the truth, I want to be part of it. My team deserves to have their story told right." The secretary nodded approvingly. "We'll arrange transportation to Washington immediately. The president wants to personally honor you and the other surviving members of Valkyrie. A formal ceremony is being planned for next week, but he felt this couldn't wait." As military aides began coordinating logistics, Jack Miller approached Eleanor hesitantly. "Master Sergeant, I've had you working here for 3 years without knowing who you really were. Why didn't you ever say anything?" Eleanor looked at her employer with a mixture of regret and resignation. "I couldn't, Jack. It wasn't just classified, it was erased. Talking about it would have meant admitting to an operation that officially never happened. Besides," she added with a faint smile, "who would have believed me, the scarred waitress claiming to be some kind of secret female commando?" Jack shook his head, embarrassment evident in his expression. "I should have known. The way you move, the way you're always aware of everything happening around you. And I was there, damn it. I flew Hueys in that same theater. I might even have transported your team at some point." "You didn't know because you weren't supposed to know," Eleanor assured him. "None of you were. That was the whole point." On the television above the counter, the news coverage had shifted. Now they were showing a photograph of Eleanor from her military days, young, determined, in desert camouflage, her dark hair pulled back tightly, standing with a group of equally fierce-looking women. The caption identified them as members of Valkyrie Team 5. "Where did they get that?" Eleanor whispered, staring at the image in disbelief. "Pentagon Archives," the secretary answered. "Part of the declassification. There's more mission reports, commendations that were written but never awarded training logs. All of it being processed for release now." Eleanor couldn't take her eyes off the image of her younger self and her team. They look so young, she murmured. We were so young. But you changed history, Thomas said softly, even if no one knew it until today. The bell above the door jangled again, and the crowd parted as a woman in an impeccable business suit entered, flanked by two men who were clearly security personnel, despite their civilian clothes. She was in her early 60s with short silver-streaked dark hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Eleanor's head snapped up at the sound, and when she saw the newcomer, she froze. Maria, Congresswoman, Maria Ramirez. Her eyes locked on Eleanor, moved forward with purposeful strides. The security personnel tried to keep pace, but she waved them back impatiently. Angel, Ramirez said, using Eleanor's old call sign, her voice thick with emotion. My God, it really is you. Eleanor rose unsteadily to her feet, and the two women stood facing each other for a heartbeat before embracing fiercely. The diner erupted in spontaneous applause as the teammates reunited after more than 3 decades. When they finally separated, both women had tears streaming down their faces. They told me you were dead. Well, Ramirez said, her voice breaking. After Germany, they said your injuries were too severe. They told me the same about you, Eleanor replied, gripping Ramirez's hands tightly. I thought I was the only one who made it out. I was in a military hospital for 6 months, Ramirez said. By the time I was well enough to ask questions, they told me the mission was classified and the team was disbanded, that I should forget it ever happened and move on with my life. Eleanor nodded in understanding. Same script they gave me, and you couldn't exactly go searching for answers without admitting to being part of something that officially didn't exist. I tried, though, Ramirez admitted. When I got into Congress, I tried to access the records. They were buried so deep, even my security clearance couldn't touch them. I've been pushing for women in combat roles all these years, knowing what we had already done but never able to say it. The Secretary of Defense cleared his throat. Congresswoman, I apologize for the deception. The classification was at the highest levels. Ramirez turned to him, her expression hardening. I understand classification, Mr. Secretary. What I don't understand is lying to the survivors about their own teammates. Do you have any idea what that does to people who've been through combat together? Before the secretary could respond, Eleanor interjected. Maria, he's making it right. Today, the truth is coming out. Ramirez's expression softened as she looked back at her former team leader. Because of you, she said, because you never stopped being exactly who you are, even when they tried to erase it. The news on the television was now showing footage from the diner itself, the viral video that had started everything now being broadcast nationwide. Eleanor watched in disbelief as her most private trauma became public spectacle. There was Jason Miller throwing money at her feet. There was Thomas recognizing her tattoo. There was the moment when years of secrecy had shattered in an instant. This is surreal, she murmured. A few hours ago, I was just the scarred waitress everyone avoided looking at. Now you're a hero, Frank Dawson said, having approached with Martha at his side. The kind of hero this country needs to remember. Eleanor shook her head. I'm not a hero, Frank. I was just a soldier doing my job. With respect, Master Sergeant, said General Hargrove, who had been listening nearby. That's exactly what makes you a hero. Doing your duty even when it costs you everything, even when no one will ever know. Outside, more vehicles were arriving, news vans with satellite dishes, black SUVs with government plates, even a few civilian cars as word spread through the small town. Victory Diner had become the epicenter of a national revelation, a place where history was being rewritten in real time. I need to call my daughters, Thomas said, suddenly pulling out his phone. They need to know who saved their father's life. As he stepped aside to make the call, Eleanor found herself surrounded by diner patrons, wanting to shake her hand, to thank her, to apologize for not having recognized her for who she truly was. The transformation in how people looked at her was jarring, from avoidance and pity to admiration and respect. Martha Dawson approached hesitantly. I don't know what to say except I'm sorry, she said, her eyes welling with tears. All these years watching how people treated you and I never spoke up. Eleanor took the older woman's hands in hers. There's nothing to apologize for, Martha. You didn't know. None of you did. Our son came back from Afghanistan with scars too, Martha confided quietly. Not ones you can see, but he struggles every day. Seeing you now, hearing your story, I wish he could be here. I think it would help him to know that someone else understands. Bring him by sometime, Eleanor said. I'd be honored to meet him. As Martha rejoined Frank, the college student who had recognized the Valkyrie tattoo approached. Master Sergeant Rogers, I'm Kevin Mitchell. I'm doing my thesis on women in combat roles. After everything settles down, would it be possible to interview you for my research? Your experience could change how we understand military history. Eleanor regarded the young man thoughtfully. You recognize the Valkyrie tattoo, how? Kevin looked slightly embarrassed. My mom was Army. She always told me stories about rumors of women who fought in Desert Storm before it was allowed. Most historians dismissed it as military urban legend, but she insisted it was true. She said she'd met a female medic who had combat experience, though the woman would never confirm it directly. What was your mother's name and unit? Eleanor asked. Captain Rebecca Mitchell, 7th Combat Support Hospital. Eleanor's eyes widened in recognition. Becky Mitchell, she treated me in Germany after the evacuation. She knew she had to have suspected something from my injuries, but she never pressed for details. She just made sure I got the care I needed and kept the bureaucrats away until I was strong enough to deal with them. Kevin's face lit up. So it's true Mom wasn't just spinning tales. Wait until I tell her she's going to flip out. Tell her Angel says thank you, Eleanor said softly. And yes, when things calm down, I'd be happy to talk to you about your research. As Kevin moved away excitedly, calling his mother Congresswoman, Ramirez returned to Eleanor's side. The president is on his way to Fort Campbell. They want us there for a preliminary briefing before we fly to Washington. Eleanor nodded, the reality of what was happening still sinking in. I need to change, she said, looking down at her diner uniform. I can't meet the president looking like this. There's a uniform waiting for you at the base, Ramirez assured her, properly tailored with all the correct insignia and decorations. They've been preparing for this declassification for months. They just didn't expect it to happen because of a viral video in a diner. A commotion near the door drew their attention. Jason Miller had returned, his face flushed with what might have been shame or determination. The crowd parted reluctantly to let him approach, many still glaring at him for his earlier behavior. Eleanor straightened as he approached, her expression guarded but not hostile. Jason stopped a respectful distance away, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Master Sergeant Rogers, he began, his voice unsteady. I know I'm the last person you want to see right now. What do you want, Jason? Eleanor asked, neither harshly nor gently. I wanted to apologize, he said, struggling to maintain eye contact. What I did was inexcusable. I've been fired, my father isn't speaking to me, and I deserve worse. He paused, taking a deep breath. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I need you to know that I'm truly sorry. Not because of the consequences to me, but because of what I did to you. The diner had fallen silent again, everyone watching this unexpected moment of contrition. Eleanor studied Jason's face, looking for any sign of insincerity, but found only genuine remorse. I was raised better than this, Jason continued, when Eleanor didn't immediately respond. My grandfather served in Korea. He taught me to respect service and sacrifice. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. Or maybe I never really understood it to begin with. He reached into his pocket and withdrew an envelope. I know money can't fix what I did, but I emptied my savings account. It's $5,000. I'd like to donate it to whatever veterans organization you think is most deserving, especially one that supports women veterans. Eleanor looked at the envelope, but made no move to take it. Keep your money, she said quietly. If you want to make amends, find a better way to do it than throwing cash at the problem. Jason nodded, accepting her rebuke without argument. Tell me how. I'll do whatever you say. Eleanor considered him for a long moment. The diner remained utterly silent, everyone waiting for her response. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm, but not unkind. Everyone deserves a second chance, she said. That's what service taught me. Sometimes you save people who wouldn't save you. Sometimes that's what makes us human. It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it was something. Jason nodded, understanding this was more grace than he deserved. If you truly want to make amends, Eleanor continued, then change. Not just your words or your actions today, but who you are fundamentally. Understand that the measure of a person isn't in their appearance or their status, but in their character and their willingness to serve others. She glanced toward General Hargrove, who had been watching the exchange with interest. "The National Guard recruiting office is just down the street," she observed. "I hear they're always looking for people willing to put others before themselves." The suggestion hung in the air, not a command, but a challenge. Jason's eyes widened slightly as he processed her words. I never considered military service," he admitted. "My father always said I wasn't cut out for it." "Most people aren't," Eleanor replied evenly, "until they try, until something bigger than themselves demands it of them. That's the test that reveals who you really are." General Hargrove stepped forward. "The recruiting office opens at 0900 Mr. Miller. Tell them General Hargrove sent you. They'll make sure you get a fair evaluation." Jason looked between Eleanor and the general, a new resolution forming in his expression. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I won't waste this opportunity." As he turned to leave, Eleanor called after him, "Jason." He paused, looking back. The slightest smile touched her lips. "The National Guard always needs volunteers. Keep showing up. That's all any of us can do." He nodded again and left the bell chiming softly behind him as he stepped into a future that might offer redemption if he was willing to work for it. The Secretary of Defense checked his watch. "We should move out. The President is expecting us at Fort Campbell within the hour, and there's a press pool assembling." Eleanor nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of all that had happened and all that was still to come. She turned to Jack. "I guess I need to give notice," she said with a faint smile. Jack shook his head. "Your job will be waiting for you whenever you want it, Master Sergeant, though I suspect you might be a bit busy for a while." "Thank you," she said simply, then looked around at the diner that had been her workplace for 3 years. "For everything." As the military aides began to coordinate their departure, Thomas returned from his call. "My daughters are beside themselves," he told Eleanor. "They want to meet you as soon as possible. They've been hearing about the angel who saved Daddy their whole lives, but they never thought they'd actually get to thank you in person." "I'd like that," Eleanor said softly, "to meet the lives that came from the one I saved." Together, they walked toward the door, but before they could exit, Samuel Sarge Williams emerged fully from the kitchen, his imposing frame blocking their path. "Master Sergeant," he said formally, then executed a perfect salute. "Semper Fium." Eleanor returned the salute crisply. "Semper Fi, Sarge." A silent understanding passed between the two veterans, a recognition of shared sacrifice, and the code that bound them together despite different branches, different wars, different experiences. As they stepped outside, Eleanor was momentarily overwhelmed by the scene that greeted her. News vans lined the street, reporters jostling for position behind hastily established police barriers. Military vehicles stood at attention like an honor guard. And the townspeople of Riverdale had gathered word, having spread rapidly through the small community. When they saw Eleanor emerge, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the crowd. People who had passed her on the street for years without a second glance now applauded and called her name. Signs hastily made read, "Thank you, Valkyrie," and "Riverdale's hero." Eleanor faltered at the sight, unprepared for this outpouring after years of invisibility. Thomas steadied her with a supportive hand on her elbow, while Congresswoman Ramirez flanked her other side. "Ready for this?" Ramirez asked quietly. "No," Eleanor admitted, "but I've been ready for worse." They made their way to the waiting convoy, the crowd parting respectfully to let them pass. As they reached the lead vehicle, an elderly veteran in a Korean war cap stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane. The police started to move him back, but Eleanor gestured for them to let him through. "Master Sergeant," the old soldier said, his voice quavering but determined, "my granddaughter is at West Point, class of 2026, the first in our family to attend the academy. I'd like her to know your story, to understand what women like you did so she could serve openly today." Eleanor was touched by the request. "What's her name?" "Cadet Jennifer Simmons, ma'am." "I'll make sure she knows," Eleanor promised. "And please tell her from one soldier to another that I'm proud of her service." The old veteran's eyes welled with tears as he saluted her. Eleanor returned the gesture with equal respect, honoring the unbroken chain of service that connected them across generations and genders. As they finally climbed into the vehicles, Eleanor took one last look at Victory Diner, the unlikely setting for a revelation that had changed the course of military history. What had begun as a simple act of cruelty had cascaded into a national reckoning, with hidden truths bringing long overdue recognition to women who had served in silence for decades. The journey to Fort Campbell passed in a blur of activity. Military aides briefed Eleanor and Ramirez on the upcoming meetings, the White House press conference, and the formal recognition ceremony being planned. Phones rang constantly with updates from Washington Pentagon officials scrambling to coordinate a response to a declassification that had happened in the most unexpected way possible. Eleanor sat quietly amid the chaos, still processing the seismic shift in her life. For 34 years, she had carried her service as a private burden, a secret she wasn't allowed to share. Now it was becoming a public narrative, a chapter of history being rewritten in real time. "It's a lot to take in, Boom," Thomas observed, noticing her silence. "I don't know how to be this person," she admitted quietly. "The hero everyone suddenly wants me to be. I've spent more than half my life being invisible." "You don't have to be anything other than who you are," he assured her. "The person who ran into fire to save strangers. The person who chose others' lives over her own safety. The person who kept her honor even when denied recognition. That's who they're responding to, not some manufactured hero." At Fort Campbell, they were ushered into a conference room that had been hastily prepared for a secure briefing. Military officers and government officials filled the space, all rising to attention when Eleanor and Ramirez entered. On a large screen at the front of the room, the presidential seal indicated a video conference was being established with the White House. General Hargrove guided Eleanor to a seat at the head of the table. "The president will be joining us momentarily," he explained. "He wanted to speak with you directly before the public statements begin." Eleanor smoothed the front of her borrowed uniform, a perfectly tailored dress, blue uniform with Master Sergeant stripes, and the array of medals and decorations she had earned but never been allowed to wear. Among them, prominently displayed, was the silver star that the secretary had brought to the diner. "Is this real?" she asked Ramirez quietly as they waited. "Or am I going to wake up behind the counter at Victory Diner with none of this having happened?" Ramirez squeezed her hand. "It's real, Angel, and it's about damn time." The screen flickered to life and the President of the United States appeared seated in the Oval Office. The room came to attention and Eleanor found herself standing straight despite her exhaustion and the emotional whirlwind of the day. "At ease," the President said, his gaze focusing on Eleanor. "Master Sergeant Rogers, it's an honor to speak with you. The nation owes you and the Valkyrie units a debt that can never be fully repaid." "Thank you, Mr. President," Eleanor replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've reviewed the preliminary files on Operation Valkyrie and your actions on February 27, 1991. The President continued. "Based on that review, I've authorized the Secretary of Defense to initiate the formal process for awarding you the Medal of Honor. The full review will take time to complete, but I wanted you to know personally that this recognition is forthcoming." A murmur ran through the room. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, awarded for acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty. Eleanor felt her knees weaken slightly at the announcement. "Sir," she began, uncertain how to respond. I know this is overwhelming," the President said, his tone softening. 34 years of silence followed by all of this in a single day. "But I want you to understand something, Master Sergeant. What's happening now isn't just about recognizing your personal courage, though. That certainly deserves recognition. It's about correcting the historical record. It's about acknowledging that women have always been part of our nation's defense, even when policy didn't officially recognize it." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Your story and the story of the Valkyrie units will change how future generations understand women's contributions to national security. It will inspire young women who may not have seen themselves in military service. And perhaps most importantly, it will bring long overdue honor to those who served alongside you, both living and fallen." Eleanor nodded, finding her voice. "That's what matters most to me, Mr. President. That my team is finally acknowledged. That the families of those we lost know the truth." "You have my word," the President assured her. "Every member of Valkyrie will be recognized. The families of the fallen will be contacted personally. Their service records will be corrected and their sacrifices honored publicly." He glanced at some papers on his desk. "I understand Congresswoman Ramirez is with you. Is that correct?" Ramirez stepped forward. "Yes, Mr. President." "Congresswoman, your service with Valkyrie Team 5 was equally distinguished. The Secretary of Defense has recommended you for the Silver Star, and I've approved that recommendation. The same recognition will be extended to the other surviving members of your team." Ramirez straightened, emotion evident in her face despite her professional composure. "Thank you, sir. I'd like both of you to join me at the White House tomorrow for a formal announcement," the president continued. "We've located Dr. O'Neill and Ms. Coleman, and they're making arrangements to be there as well. Ms. Jackson is currently traveling abroad but will be connected virtually." Eleanor and Ramirez exchanged a look of shared amazement. After more than 3 decades, their team was being reunited. "We'd be honored, Mr. President," Eleanor said. The briefing continued for another 30 minutes with officials outlining the plan for public disclosure, the press conference scheduled for later that afternoon, and the formal ceremony to follow in the coming weeks. Throughout it all, Eleanor maintained her composure, responding to questions with the same quiet authority that had once guided her team through hostile territory. When the meeting concluded, she was escorted to a private office to prepare for the press conference. As the door closed behind her, leaving her alone for the first time since the morning's revelations, Eleanor finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. She sank into a chair, her hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline that had sustained her began to ebb. On the desk before her was a folder marked Classified Operation Valkyrie. After all these years of silence, of being unable to speak of what she had experienced, the truth was literally at her fingertips. She opened the folder with reverent care, as if handling sacred texts. Inside were photographs her team in training in desert camouflage during their deployment at their final briefing before the rescue mission. There were mission reports, performance evaluations, commendation, recommendations that had never been processed. And there were personnel files the women she had served with, had loved as sisters, had mourned in private for decades. She traced their faces in the photographs, memories flooding back with painful clarity. Ramirez, the fierce sniper who could hit a target at 1,000 yards, but also spoke 5 languages. O'Neill, the surgeon whose hands could repair shattered bodies in minutes. Coleman, the communications specialist who could make a radio work in any conditions. Jackson, the intelligence analyst who could read a battlefield like a book. And the ones who hadn't come home. Martinez, Chen Williams, Patel, Brooks. Women who had given everything in service to a country that wouldn't even acknowledge they had served in combat. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Thomas entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use this," he said, placing one before her. "It's not as good as what you make at Victory, but it's hot." "Thank you," she said, grateful for both the coffee and his steady presence. He sat across from her, noticing the open folder. "Finding answers. Finding pieces of myself I thought were gone forever," she replied, showing him a photograph of her team. "I've carried them with me every day for 34 years, but I couldn't even speak their names out loud. Couldn't tell anyone what they did, what they sacrificed." Thomas studied the image. "They look like warriors." "They were," Eleanor confirmed, "and the best I've ever known." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee, each lost in their own memories of that distant desert night. "What happens next?" Thomas asked eventually. "After the press conferences and ceremonies, after the medals and recognition. What do you want your life to look like, Eleanor?" Eleanor considered the question. For so long, her life had been defined by what she couldn't say, by the secrets she was forced to keep. The possibility of a future unburdened by that silence was almost too vast to contemplate. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to go back to Victory Diner, put on my apron, and pour coffee like none of this ever happened. And the other part," she smiled faintly, "the other part wants to make up for lost time, to tell our story, to make sure no one else has to wait 34 years for the truth to be acknowledged." Thomas nodded, understanding. "Whatever you decide, I'll be there, if you want me to be." Eleanor reached across the desk, taking his hand in hers. "I spent 34 years thinking I failed to save you. I'm not letting you out of my sight anytime soon, Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds." A soft knock interrupted them, and Congresswoman Ramirez entered, now dressed in a formal uniform with her own decorations prominently displayed. "They're ready for us," she said. "The press is assembled, and the secretary is about to begin his statement." Eleanor rose, straightening her uniform one last time. "How do I look?" "Like exactly who you are," Ramirez replied with a smile. "A warrior and a leader. Our angel." Together they walked through the corridors of Fort Campbell, passing soldiers who snapped to attention as they recognized the significance of what was happening. At the entrance to the press briefing room, they paused. "Ready?" Ramirez asked. Eleanor took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Ready." They stepped into the glare of camera lights facing a room packed with reporters and military officials. The Secretary of Defense was at the podium, his expression solemn as he began the official announcement that would rewrite military history. "Good afternoon. Today, the Department of Defense is officially acknowledging the existence and service of the Valkyrie Special Operations Unit's all-female combat teams that operated during Desert Storm in 1991. These extraordinary women served with a distinction in direct combat roles more than 2 decades before such service was officially permitted by military policy." As the secretary spoke, Eleanor stood tall, her scars visible and unashamed in the harsh light of the cameras. No longer marks of shame to be hidden, but badges of honor earned through extraordinary sacrifice and service. The weight she had carried for 34 years, the burden of silence, of unacknowledged sacrifice, of believing she had failed, began to lift from her shoulders. Whatever came next, the truth was finally being told. The women of Valkyrie would take their rightful place in military history, their service acknowledged, their sacrifices honored. And perhaps somewhere a young woman would hear their story and find the courage to follow a path that had been blazed for her decades earlier by women who served with honor even when that service could not be acknowledged. 6 months later, Victory Diner had been transformed. The Wall of Honor had been expanded now, featuring a special section dedicated to the Valkyrie team. Eleanor's photograph in desert camouflage occupied the central position, surrounded by images of her teammates and citations detailing their extraordinary service. News articles about the declassification and subsequent congressional hearings were framed alongside personal mementos donated by the families of those who had served. Eleanor herself moved through the diner with a new confidence, her uniform now including short sleeves that made no attempt to hide her scars. Regular customers had grown accustomed to the sight, many now understanding the story behind them. New patrons sometimes stared, but it was with respect rather than disgust, particularly when they recognized her from the extensive media coverage that had followed the declassification. Jack had promoted her to manager, insisting that her organizational skills and leadership abilities were being wasted on serving coffee. She had accepted reluctantly at first, but soon discovered that the same qualities that had made her an effective team leader in combat translated well to civilian management. The bell above the door chimed, and Eleanor looked up to see Thomas Reynolds entering. In the months since their reunion, he had become a regular presence at the diner, eventually relocating to Riverdale permanently to be closer to the woman who had saved his life. Their relationship had evolved from the awkward intensity of their first reunion to something comfortable and profound, a friendship forged in shared trauma and mutual respect that was gradually becoming something more. "Morning, El," he greeted, using the nickname that only he was permitted. "Ready for today?" Eleanor nodded, though her expression betrayed her nervousness. "As ready as I'll ever be. Is everything set? The car's outside. Ramirez and the others are already at Fort Campbell. The ceremony starts at noon." Today was the day Eleanor would formally receive the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, in recognition of her actions during Operation Valkyrie. The ceremony would be televised, nationally attended by the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the surviving members of her team. It represented the final step in the public acknowledgement of a service that had been hidden for too long. "I still can't believe this is happening," Eleanor admitted, untying her apron and hanging it carefully on its hook. "After all these years of silence, to have everything so public, it's overwhelming." Thomas squeezed her shoulder gently. "You deserve every bit of it. Your team deserves it. This isn't just about recognition. It's about correcting the historical record. Future generations will know that women were serving in combat with distinction and courage long before the regulations officially would allowed it." The door chimed again, and a tall figure in National Guard uniform entered, standing at a respectful parade rest just inside the entrance. It took Eleanor a moment to recognize Jason Miller beneath the military haircut and polished appearance. "Private Miller," she acknowledged, genuine surprise in her voice. "I didn't expect to see you today." Jason maintained his formal posture. "Master Sergeant Rogers, I wanted to congratulate you before the ceremony, and to thank you." "For what?" Eleanor asked. "For showing me a better path," he replied simply. "Basic training was the hardest thing I've ever done. I failed the first time, had to recycle, but I kept showing up like you said. It's changed me in ways I can't fully explain. Eleanor studied him, noting the genuine transformation in his bearing and demeanor. The arrogant construction foreman who had tormented her was gone, replaced by someone who understood something fundamental about service and respect. "Will you be at the ceremony?" she asked. Jason shook his head. "No, ma'am. My unit is deploying next week for hurricane relief on the Gulf Coast. I ship out this afternoon. But I wanted you to know that I think about what you said every day, about second chances and about saving people who wouldn't save you. I'm trying to live up to that example." Eleanor extended her hand and Jason shook it firmly. No further words were necessary. The gesture communicated everything that needed to be said between them. As Jason left, Thomas watched him go with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he observed, "in all my years of service, I never saw a more effective recruiting officer than you. One suggestion, and you completely redirected that man's life." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Sometimes people just need someone to believe they can be better than they are. The military taught me that. My team taught me that." Speaking of her team, the reunion with the surviving members of Valkyrie 5 had been emotional beyond words. After 3 decades of separation, of carrying their individual burdens in silence, they had come together again with the fierce bond that only shared combat could forge. Congresswoman Ramirez had used her political influence to push for expedited recognition of all Valkyrie units. Dr. O'Neill had established a specialized treatment program for female combat veterans. Coleman and Jackson had joined advocacy groups supporting women in military service. Together, they had testified before Congress about their experiences putting human faces to a classified program that had paved the way for policy changes decades later. Their testimony had been powerful, emotional, and ultimately transformative for military policy moving forward. As Eleanor and Thomas walked out of the diner toward the waiting car, she paused for a moment to look back at Victory Diner, the unlikely setting for a revelation that had changed military history. What had begun as a simple act of cruelty had cascaded into a national reckoning with hidden truths, bringing long overdue recognition to women who had served in silence for decades. "Ready, Master Sergeant?" Thomas asked gently. Eleanor straightened her shoulders and nodded, the sunlight catching the silver strands in her hair and gleaming on the scars she no longer hid. "Ready, Lieutenant Colonel." As they drove toward Fort Campbell, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the burning deserts of Iraq to the quiet anonymity of civilian life, from the painful isolation of carrying classified truths to the public recognition that awaited her today, it had been a road marked by sacrifice, resilience, and ultimately vindication. But more important than the medal she would receive today was the knowledge that her team's story would finally be told in full. The women of Valkyrie would take their rightful place in military history, their service acknowledged, their sacrifices honored. And perhaps somewhere a young woman would hear their story and find the courage to follow a path that had been blazed for her 3 decades earlier by women who served with honor, even when that service could not be acknowledged. "Honor isn't found in medals or recognition," Eleanor said softly as the gates of Fort Campbell came into view. "It's in standing up when called, doing the right thing, when no one is watching, and respecting those who came before us. That's the tradition we must uphold from one generation to the next." Thomas nodded, understanding the profound truth in her words. As they passed through the gates, a formation of soldiers snapped to attention, rendering honors to the scarred waitress from Victory Diner, who had finally been recognized as the hero she had always been. 6 months later, Eleanor Rogers stood at a podium in the auditorium of West Point Military Academy. Before her sat rows of young cadets, their faces attentive and earnest. In the front row, Cadet Jennifer Simmons, granddaughter of the Korean War veteran from Riverdale, watched with particular intensity. "The lesson I want you to take from my story isn't about medals or recognition," Eleanor was saying. "It's about doing what's right even when no one is watching, even when you know your actions may never be acknowledged. That's the true measure of service." She had been invited to speak as part of a new educational series on women in military history. Her story and the story of the Valkyrie units was now included in the curriculum at all service academies, a chapter of history reclaimed from the shadows of classified operations. "When I went into that burning Humvee in 1991, I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because there were people who needed help, and I was trained to provide that help. The fact that it took 34 years for that service to be officially acknowledged doesn't change the value of what we did. The worth of your service isn't determined by who sees it or who praises it. It's determined by the lives you touch, the difference you make. As she spoke, Eleanor could see Thomas sitting in the back of the room, watching her with pride. Their relationship had deepened in the months since her recognition, a bond forged in shared experience and mutual respect that had gradually blossomed into love. Next week, they were getting married in a small ceremony at Victory Diner, surrounded by her team in the community that had embraced her true identity. Some of you will serve in the light, your actions visible and celebrated. Others may serve in the shadows, your contributions known only to a few. Both are equally valuable, equally necessary. The measure of your service isn't in the decorations you receive, but in the integrity with which you execute your duty. Eleanor glanced down at the Medal of Honor hanging around her neck, the nation's highest military decoration, awarded to her in a White House ceremony that had made headlines around the world. It was heavy both physically and symbolically. This medal doesn't belong to me alone, she continued. It belongs to every member of Valkyrie Team 5. It belongs to Rodriguez and Thompson who didn't make it home. It belongs to every woman who has ever served this country, whether her service was acknowledged or not. She looked out at the young faces before her, men and women preparing to take their place in the long line of those who had sworn to protect and defend. The future of military service looking to her for wisdom from the past. Your generation won't face the same barriers we did. You won't have to hide your service or deny your contributions. But you will face your own challenges, your own moments of choice between what is easy and what is right. In those moments, remember that true honor lies not in recognition, but in the quiet knowledge that you did your duty with courage and integrity. As the cadets rose to give her a standing ovation, Eleanor felt a sense of completion, of a circle finally closing. The secrets she had carried for so long had become lessons for those who would follow. The burden had transformed into a legacy. Outside the auditorium, Thomas was waiting. "Powerful speech," he said as she joined him. "Those kids will remember that for the rest of their careers." "I hope so," Eleanor replied. "It's strange to think that our story is history now. Something taught in classrooms and written about in books. History that might have been lost if not for a bully in a diner," Thomas observed wryly. Eleanor smiled at the irony. Life takes the strangest paths sometimes. As they walked across the academy grounds, a young female cadet approached, saluting crisply. "Master Sergeant Rogers, I'm Cadet Simmons. My grandfather asked me to give you his regards." Eleanor returned the salute. "At ease, Cadet. Your grandfather is very proud of you, as am I." "Thank you, ma'am," Simmons replied, her expression earnest. "Your story, it's why I'm here. Why I believed I could be here." "That's the greatest honor of all," Eleanor told her softly, "to know that our story helped open doors for others to follow." As they continued toward the waiting car, Eleanor looked back at the young cadet now rejoining her peers. The future of military service shaped in part by a past that had almost been erased. "You know what this means, don't you?" Thomas asked, following her gaze. "This is just the beginning. Your story, the Valkyrie story, it's going to inspire generations of service members. The ripples will continue long after we're gone." Eleanor nodded, understanding the truth of his words. What had begun in secrecy and sacrifice had transformed into a legacy of courage and service that would endure. The scars she had hidden for so long had become symbols of honor, reminders of the price paid for freedom and the quiet heroism that often goes unseen. As they drove away from West Point, heading back toward the small town where their story had finally come to light, Eleanor felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for 34 years. The burden of silence had been lifted. The truth had been told. Justice long delayed had finally been served. And in diners and classrooms, in military bases, in civilian homes across America, people were learning the story of the women who had served with honor even when that service could not be acknowledged. The legend of the Valkyries, once a classified secret, had become a chapter in the ongoing story of American courage and sacrifice. For Eleanor Rogers, scarred waitress and decorated hero, that was recognition enough.